Great.
My camera seems to be locked, but I am delighted to welcome everyone to the seminar this afternoon. Hopefully you're all here for the right one. It is navigating farm level greenhouse gas assessments. And I know this has been a really popular topic. It came up at the CXC meetings in Edinburgh last week. So everyone's really keen to hear about greenhouse gas calculators and what's happening in the project. So thanks everyone for the opportunity to chair the meeting today. I'm the co-lead of the Land Use for Net Zero Hub, a sister project to the one that's presenting today. So from Footprint today, we have three speakers. We have Paul Burgess, who I can see on my screen from Cranfield University. We have Julie Ingram from CCRI, who I can see as well. And then we have Eleanor Durant, Senior Learning Officer from the Cool Farming Alliance. So each will have about 15 minutes or so to speak, and I will be keeping an eye on the time because we want to have lots of time for questions at the end. So we will pause for questions of clarification immediately after each presentation, but we're going to save the more substantial discussion for the end because it's probably something that multiple speakers would like to weigh in on. Look at that, my camera just became available. I am in fact here in the room. So is there any other housekeeping that I need to cover? We're all online, so we don't have to worry about fire alarms, I don't think.
I think we're fine, are we?
Good to go, yeah.
Good stuff. Well then, welcome to this Footprint seminar. And Paul, are you going first?
Yes. Can you see
Excellent.
my screen? Is that being shared?
We can indeed. Well done.
Excellent. So thanks very much, Leanne. Thanks very much for the welcome from the Land Use for Net Zero programme. As Leanne has mentioned, Lund's Footprint is one of the 5 research programmes sponsored under the Transforming Land Use for Net Zero Nature and People programme, sponsored by UKRI, DEFRA, DESNES, DERA, Scottish Government and Welsh Government. And as you've mentioned, Leanne, 3 of us, we've split the talk into 3 sections, which will hopefully make it a little bit more sort of digestible. And so firstly, we're just going to briefly introduce the project. I'll cover then the area of sort of perspectives, understanding how farm level greenhouse gas accounting sort of fits into the broader landscape. Eleanor from Cool Farm will then talk about numbers and some of the work with the greenhouse gas assessment tools, looking at sort of harmonisation and different tools for different questions. And Julie will bring up the rear and answer all the difficult questions on the subject of building capacity and learning. So Lund's Footprint is, as I said, a 3-year project as part of the Lund's programme. And really what we're looking at is trying to develop, by working with a wide range of stakeholders, a sort of scalable, sort of impactful at scale, auditable, that we can be assured that the numbers that we're getting are sensible farm greenhouse gas assessments in the UK. And we have sort of 5 research work packages. One is engaging with 100 farmers, 4 nations and regional stakeholders in a living lab arrangement. Second work package is sort of building sort of capacity. A third is being led by SIGC, working with the greenhouse gas assessment companies, looking at how to improve the assessments. Aberdeen is working on or leading a work package looking at how do we validate the data that we're getting. And Harper Adams is leading a work package focused on governance and equitability. So looking at some of the power relationships, international, domestic production. So it's a wide-ranging, ambitious project involving 100 farmers, 5 universities, 4 nations, 3 greenhouse gas calculator companies, and Savills is also a partner working on the validation side of things. And here's a picture of our research team, so to just show that we have physically met in person. So I guess one of the things that I've learned in the initial parts of the project when we're looking at greenhouse gas assessments, we are looking at assessments, not measurements. Measuring is incredibly sort of difficult and laborious and very expensive. So what we're looking at here and what we're describing in this session is ways of estimating based on sort of peer-reviewed science and sort of best data, but we're looking at assessments. So I just wanted to spend a bit of time just outlining five or three sort of perspectives. How we look at things all depends upon partly where we're standing, what our own motivations are. And I briefly just want to explain how perhaps we can understand the government perspective for net zero, the perspective of retailers, and the perspective of farms. And these all interact and interact with each other. So as we all probably know, UK government has a net target for net zero territorial emissions by 2050. And since 1990, within the UK, we've managed to decline the level of net emissions by 53%, whilst at the same time the population has increased by 19%. So that's, you know, an incredible sort of progress. But territorial emissions is sort of just one aspect of it. It's also interesting to consider our consumptive emissions, and in perhaps the initial years, 1990 up to about 2010, our levels of consumptive emissions. This includes the embedded emissions in imports that, for instance, we consume. Our consumptive emissions remained at sort of quite high level, but they've now sort of started to decline. And internationally, if all countries aimed for net zero at 2050, those consumptive emissions and those territorial emissions should sort of converge on each other. And that sort of, with a lot of these sort of numbers and tools, holding in your head a number of ways of looking at things can be useful. So looking at consumptive emissions can be useful when we're sort of considering some of the sort of tension between, do we reduce production in this country, but would that then just mean that we import emissions from elsewhere? So retaining and understanding a range of metrics can be very useful. So the UK government does an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions each year. 5 broad categories. Energy, as you can see here, is by far the largest. Industrial emissions and waste emissions, and it's in those sectors that we've seen the largest decreases. Agriculture there at the bottom, currently about sort of 10, 11, 12%. But as emissions decrease in other sectors, the proportion coming from agriculture increases. So following guidelines from the IPCC within the agricultural assessment, that includes fermentation from ruminants, manure management, fertilizer emissions, crop residues. There's also this red category, land use change and forestry. So that's the net balance between sequestration by the forestry sector and emissions from land use change, from wetlands. As grassland goes to wetlands, wetlands go to grassland, and the effects then on soil carbon. And a key factor in there is where or not peatlands are included. So that there's both sort of positives and negatives there. And at present, they're roughly sort of in balance. And looking forward, one of the key focuses of government is how we can increase the levels of sequestration there, so that can draw down levels of greenhouse gas. We've got agriculture at the bottom, but some aspects of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions aren't included. So fuel use on farm is included within the energy sector. And as sort of mentioned before, if the focus is on territorial emissions, then emissions associated with the production of fertilizers that we import from other countries or animal feeds from other countries, they're not included within these government figures. And the government, when calculating and assessing greenhouse gas emissions, that's all based on protocols developed by the United Nations Framework on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where there's a range of methods at 3 levels: Tier 3, Tier 1, 2, and Tier 1. At the most simplistic level, Tier 1, you might simply say methane emissions from cattle in a given part of the world is a certain amount of methane per head per year. But where a country can develop more precise emissions than in the national inventory, then that is the recommended way forward. So that's sort of a governmental perspective. A key driver in the whole area of farm-based emissions is the perspective of retailers. And then through initiatives such as the financial disclosure directive in the EU, through consumer pressure, most large companies have set emission targets for their greenhouse gas emissions, both in terms of their scope 1 emissions, that's emissions that they directly control within the company, scope 2, electricity use, but also scope 3, upstream and downstream from the actual company itself. And in the same way that at a national level, there's protocols to establish the levels and the assessments of greenhouse gas. At an organizational level, the International Standards Organization and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which are increasingly working together, have established protocols for working out greenhouse gases within a company. And a key player in this is the Science Based Targets initiative, which provides a way for each individual large company to set their own greenhouse gas target. And you can go onto the Science Based Targets Initiative website, and for a range of companies, you can see the targets that they have set themselves, both in terms of their scope 1 and 2 emissions, but also upstream and downstream, and particularly in terms of major retailers, a large proportion of those greenhouse gas emissions are in scope 3 and are related to the agricultural sector. They've set both near-term emissions for over the next 5-7 years, but also long-term targets through to 2050. And that drive and those commitments for major retailers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions creates a major push factor within the farming community. If retailers are going to meet those targets, then it's important that processors reduce the emissions associated with their products, and in turn that gets fed back through to farmers. So key push factors driven by national legislation are supply chain drivers. But as Eleanor will talk to, there are also immediate benefits to farmers in terms of improving decision making, identifying some of the key areas within the business where it might be able to improve energy use, improve nutrient use of efficiency. So there are both pull and push factors in terms of promoting the use of greenhouse gas assessment tools on farms. So I think that was the just a quick overview of some of the landscape, I guess, Leanne, in terms of farm greenhouse gas accounting. I guess,
thank
was
you.
there any immediate questions, I guess, on any of that? I guess.
John. Jed Gilliland from Northern Ireland, I believe. Come on in. Oh, I think you're muted, or there's something going on because we can't hear you.
We have to allow the mic.
Okay, thank you. First of all, Paul, very good articulation of the breadth of the landscape. Just my question is, in the work that you're doing, is there any reflection of how we join up the private sector initiatives, the public sector initiatives? As a farmer, I only want to hand over my data once, but I would like it used many times, rather than private sector asking, the government asking, bank manager asking. Is there any reflections of, actually, can we go on this journey in a joint up approach to make my life as a time poor farmer easier?
No, so I think we're still a long way to go on that journey. Alan, did you any ideas on that sort of transfer of information and how we use that in that way? That hasn't specifically come up, has it, Julie? So much that.
Not from the farmer consultation so far, but perhaps we can park that and discuss it at the end of the webinar, John, because it's a kind of nutty issue that needs. Yeah. Thanks for the question, anyway.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Are there any more points of clarification for Paul? We will have opportunity at the end to talk more between the different speakers around those topics. I know, John, that's one that I think multiple speakers might want to come in on. I'm just having a quick look to see if any hands are coming up, but I'm not seeing any. So I think we may be passing to Eleanor then. Thank you so much for sticking to time so far. I think we're moving efficiently through, which is absolutely great, Paul. Thank you. Over to Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne, and hi everyone. I'm Dr. Eleanor Durran, and I'm the Senior Learning Officer at the Cool Farm Alliance. So Cool Farm is one of 3 calculators that are part of the Lands Footprint project, along with AgriCalc and Farm Carbon Toolkit. And I think between us, we are 3 of the main calculators that are used within the UK. So my role is to deliver the Lands Footprint project within Cool Farm. And so today I'm going to give you a short overview of greenhouse gas assessment tools, what us 3 as calculators are doing to harmonise the industry, and a bit about our participation within the Lands project. So firstly, I know Paul already touched on this, but I just really want to make sure that we're all on the same page around what a greenhouse gas assessment tool is. And I think Paul highlighted it really clearly earlier, that we are not directly measuring greenhouse gas emissions on your farm, but we are modelling and estimating those based on data that you provide and scientific evidence regarding emissions. And in this case, we often hear the word carbon calculator thrown around as well, but it's just to highlight that it is not just carbon that we are looking at, but it's also methane and nitrous oxide as the 3 primary greenhouse gas emitters in the agricultural sector. So Cool Farm, AgriCalc and Farm Carbon Toolkit, as well as other sort of greenhouse gas assessment tools. We are decision support software tools to enable farm level greenhouse gas emissions assessments. Generally, we say that at Cool Farm, at least, it's from cradle to farm gate, so until the product leaves your farm. And these are used primarily for 2 different reasons. So the first one is to aid decision making by identifying hotspots to reduce emissions. And then secondly, to track and report progress against targets. So these can be things like SBTI, as Paul also just mentioned. And as I mentioned already, we're not providers of absolute numbers, but we are modeling your emissions based on the data you give us and the science that we have available. So most of our models are based on the IPCC and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but between calculators, there can be many differences due to things like system boundaries, the methodological assumptions, the sources of emission factors that you're using, or how you're treating land-based carbon removals. So, for instance, sorry, I think that table is slightly blurrier than I had anticipated. But for instance, one broad category of approach would be a whole farm carbon footprint. So this is what, for instance, the farm carbon calculator would do. And this is based on corporate accounting methods, and they are assessing your emissions for 12 months of your business operation. And because of this, they may include things like the emissions from your farm shop. This is used for business level decision making, reporting to lenders or landlords, and maybe reporting on land-based emissions. So this is a contrasting to approach to what we do at Cool Farm, which is a product footprint. So here we're drawing more on a life cycle assessment approach, and we are modeling the emissions for a specific farm product, usually then giving you results and emissions per ton of product, say for an annual crop. So this is used for product level decision making and supply chain reporting at a product basis. And it's worth noting that even if you entered the same information into two different calculators, you could end up with different answers due to the fact that we may be assessing different things, or there may be slight differences in the methodologies, such as potentially using different emissions factor sources. Yeah, thanks, Paul. I was looking a bit confused then. So yeah, a big reason for these different calculators is that we're often answering different questions. And I want to highlight that neither approach is right or wrong. We've just been developed to address different questions for different users. So for instance, if I'm asking what are the emissions caused by producing my beef, then you'd want to be drawing on a life cycle assessment approach that follows the production cycle for your beef. And you're best then answering that question using a product like the Cool Farm platform. However, on the other hand, you might be a farmer assessing your management changes or banks performing climate risk assessments, and you're more interested in the question, what are the emissions caused by this overall farm business? And therefore, you might want to take a whole farm footprint approach, which aligns more with standards for business or corporate carbon accounting. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, the footprint would follow the activities of the entire business over a set time period, and that would cover all of the crops or livestock they grow and raise on the farm. And then you would potentially use a product like the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So, although we answer different questions, we are working together to harmonise our methodologies. And when I say we, I am specifically talking about AgriCalc, Farm Carbon Toolkit and the Cool Farm Alliance. So it is at the moment, us three calculators that are doing this. And what I mean by harmonisation is a process through which us as tool developers are collaborating, sharing knowledge to develop shared principles, minimum standards and consistent reporting conventions. So this doesn't mean that we are aiming to give you the same number, but it means that we're aiming to be consistent in certain underlying methodologies, for instance, how we can report results. And this does contrast to standardization, which would be the imposition of a single uniform methodology. So harmonization would allow us as tools to continue to evolve in the ways that meets the needs for our specific users. But this is a really, to be honest, slow and long collaborative endeavor, and it requires us as tools to discuss our methods openly, discuss the challenges we face with each other, and then work out how we can actually address some of those together to progress the industry forward. So all farm greenhouse gas calculators likely do have some core components in common. So this would be things like modelling your fuel and energy use, purchased fertilizers and feeds, the enteric fermentation of any livestock that you have, However, different questions lead to different system boundaries and data inclusion. So there is more data that is often calculator dependent. For instance, at Cool Farm specifically, we're a member organisation, so our development priorities are set by our members, and this also might lead us to have different priorities to another calculator who has a different user base. Standardization would remove the ability to examine these different contexts, but harmonization would allow us to align where possible while still providing our core product. So for instance, an example of where we've recently harmonized our methods together is on how to calculate emissions from purchased livestock. And then I also wanted to highlight how tools address carbon removals. So again, this is dependent on its intended user and purpose. Standards and guidance for reporting carbon removals is still emergent, and many tools are in an early stage of development, often focusing on models for decision-making aid over reporting requirements that are a lot more stringent and may require direct measurements. However, tools that are being used, for instance, to generate carbon removal credits on the voluntary carbon market would obviously need a lot more accurate ways to be estimating or measuring those carbon removals. So models are very much still developing and can also be very resource intensive to develop and use. But as calculators, we are trying our best to start developing these with the information that we have. And it's always this balance, particularly when it comes to removals, but also all calculators, the trade-off between model accuracy, realistic data provision that does not overburden the farmer or whoever is providing that data. So I just want to touch briefly around our participation in the Lunds Footprint project. So as calculators, we have three main roles within the Lunds Footprint project. Firstly, it's to take an active role in the living lab approach of the project and the research. Secondly, it's to lead farmer recruitment and training in doing greenhouse gas assessments. And then thirdly, it's conducting assessments with participating farmers and helping them to do and understand how to interpret their assessment. So we take an active role in the living lab. This means that, for instance, I'm here today presenting. We attend and participate in workshops with farmers. We've attended and participated in the regional workshops with wider stakeholders. We're developing frequently asked questions as part of the project for farmers based on their continual feedback throughout this process. We've also led farmer recruitment. So there are 100 farmers on the project. At Cool Farm, we've recruited 29 of those. And then Farm Carbon Toolkit has their own cohort, and so does AgriCalc. And then after recruiting farmers, we have trained them in doing greenhouse gas assessments with us and have provided them with very specific training to get them, give them a deeper understanding that they would have otherwise in using our tools. And then finally, we, as I said, are conducting 2 greenhouse gas assessments over 2 years. So in 2025, we worked with 29 British farmers and we totaled 81 product level assessments with those farmers across annual crops, beef, dairy and perennial systems. This is Cool Farm specific. So in total, there are many more assessments if you also included AgriCalc and Farm Carbon Toolkit. And we provided all of those farmers with personal support, whether that was over the phone, in person or online or over email, to really make sure that they understood the project, how to use us as calculators, their data and what that really means. And this, is very much an ongoing process as part of the project. We're currently planning to go into year 2, starting in a few months. So I'll now say thank you and hand over to Julie, unless there are any immediate questions, to discuss more around some of the research that's going on around this farmer cohort I just mentioned.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Eleanor. Does anyone have a question? Judith has a question. Judith Thornton.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for that. That was really interesting, Eleanor. Am I right in thinking then that each of the tools has got a separate cohort? So you're not actually okay. So out of interest, then, how did you arrive at the point where you weren't putting the same farms into 3 different calculators, but you're deliberately, you've chosen to deliberately treat them differently? It'd be interesting to hear how why you decided that particular approach.
Yeah, I don't know if that's maybe perhaps better answered by Paul and Julie.
Yeah.
From a research perspective.
So each of the farmers are interacting with just one tool company, but then in the back rooms, we're going to be running the data through each of the 3 tools. So there are potentially 4 outputs from each of the analyses, really. One is the individual farmers would receive what they would normally have from Cool Farm. And then we've sort of developed, as far as possible, a sort of coherent sort of Lunds footprint, which we'll try and run, which we're running through the 3 calculators, and through that process learning, where the differences are, where the similarities are. So that's still an ongoing process.
Thanks, Paul. Any more questions of clarification?
It's probably worth saying that the calculator spent probably the first 3 months intensively designing a common entry sheet for the project, a common data entry sheet to manage this process. Eleanor, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add there, but I know it was a bit of a headache at the beginning, but you got there eventually.
Yeah, no, nothing. Nothing to add. Yeah, we are now currently redesigning that for this year as well. Less of a headache the second time.
I think one of the other positive things in the project has been able to lubricate and sort of facilitate these 3 companies working together, and to provide some resource to sort of harmonise where possible.
Am I right in saying that these calculators don't stay the same over time either? They're constantly being improved as new evidence becomes available, the science advances, that sort of thing. So the Cool Farm tool 5 years ago is not the Cool Farm tool today, which makes harmonization an additional challenge. But I did actually have a question of clarification myself I wanted to ask. I think I've got my head around the Cool Farm tool, that's product. So how much my beef across its kind of lifespan to the shelf, the emissions associated with that, versus the farm carbon toolkit, which is just my farm and what it does. But I didn't quite catch AgriCalc. What is its particular focus?
Yeah, so AgriCalc, I would say, can do both. So at AgriCalc, they do down to enterprise level, but also at the whole farm. So I think they start at a whole farm approach, and then if you want to, you can separate you can allocate down to an enterprise level with them.
So do they go along the supply chain then as well?
Yes, I would think so. I'm not 100% clear. I can see John nodding, so maybe he knows more than me. Yeah, I think all 3 calculators are used by different actors within the supply chain at different points.
Oh, are there any other points of clarification, John?
No, just to confirm, all 3 calculators can do it both ways. The difficulty, and I will always encourage farmers, whatever calculator you start with, continue with them. Don't chop and change between calculators, because that's when you get completely confused. And never go into a situation where you're using 2 or more calculators with the same data, because you'll get 3 totally different answers and you'll confuse the farmers even further. Part of this isn't just about product footprint. It is actually helping farmers to make better quality decisions. So we need to do it in a way that is clear and doesn't send mixed messages to farmers.
Thanks, John. Yes. I know there's a fair number of us non-farmers, academics, looking at this from the outside and thinking, yeah, I want to get clear in my head about this. So that's where this seminar is really helpful. I think it's over to you now, Julie.
Okay, thank you. Paul has the slides, I think. Okay, thanks. A little bit of social science now, if you like. The social science side of the project has been looking at a couple of elements. One of them is looking at the governance and equity side of the tool landscape, but also within my particular work package, we've been looking at the capacity building and learning aspects of these tools so that we can think about how to empower farmers more to use them to help make decisions on the farm, but also have a kind of stake in the process and not just be at the bottom of a very top-down process again. We've started off by looking at the tool ecosystem, if you like, the landscape, this very dynamic landscape there, as Eleanor has told us, just within the three tools, there's a huge difference. If you multiply that to the other tools that are out there as well, whether they're used within the public sector or the private sector, it's a very complex system and dynamic and changing all the time. We also want to look at the nature and extent of the sorts of support and advice that calculator users are receiving and where that's coming from, and what are the competence and skills of the providers and the users, not just, are farmers equipped to deal with these, but what about people across the whole agricultural knowledge system? Where are those skill gaps that need to be improved? We're particularly interested in how these calculators can help farmer learning and their decision making at the farm, because ultimately it's those mitigation practices at the end of the day which are more important than the actual number. And how to foster peer-to-peer learning and benchmarking where it's appropriate. As you say, John, it's benchmarking yourself often rather than with other farmers is more important. So overall, thinking about where improvements are needed. Thanks, Paul. And then just a little bit of context why we think learning is important. It's a complex landscape. There's a big emphasis these days with net zero and the financialization of carbon as well through voluntary markets, with a very big emphasis on the whole carbon governance of net zero transition, looking at calculating, standardizing and accounting. This has been referred to in other contexts as the metrological regime. If you like, it's abstracting one figure or one metric from a very complex farm ecosystem. For measurements purposes, and that doesn't always sit well with farmers who have to manage things on a day-to-day basis. So from a practitioner's point of view, it's a lot of learning is involved. There's new demands, new narratives to understand, new concepts, terms and metrics to wade through as well. So that's the context of why we're interested in this aspect of learning and capacity building. Don't look at the detail here, but this is just a kind of conceptual framework we're developing. There's a vast amount of studies that have gone into farmer learning and also the capacities and the enabling environment that allows that learning or access to learning and interventions. And the learning processes that come out in the end and how they affect the mitigation measures. So, Paul, if you'd like to click a couple of times. What we're starting to think about is this idea of situated literacies. We hear a lot about net zero literacy, but it's never really been explained. We've been looking at the literacy literature to try and understand that. And we're also thinking about this idea of first and second loop learning, which explained very simply here is whether you do things incrementally by doing things better, i.e., are you just going to go incrementally and learn how to use the tool a little bit better? Or are you going to think about second loop learning and doing better things? Really, start to question things on the farm, your values and your assumptions, and have a little bit of critical thinking and analysis there. So that's as far as we've got so far with our conceptual thinking. For you social scientists out there, that might be of interest. So what do we mean by literacy? It's a wide range of skills and competencies of accessing and seeking out, comprehending and evaluating information and data. It's also referred to as being situated. So every literacy is developed in a context in relation to a place or people as well. And then literacies are also, next slide please, they're what we call socio-technical or socio-political. They don't happen in a vacuum. There are power relations, equity issues, capacity and access issues as well that determine how people have access to different literacy opportunities. And they're also described as sites of struggle. It's not easy sometimes to understand these tools or to comprehend them and use them. Ooh. Right. Okay, so thinking about the methods we've been using so far, we have some preliminary results from investigating what learning is happening. We have our 100 farm managers who've completed one farm assessment so far, and we've been able to collect some qualitative data from surveys of farmers, from assessing the observations of the assessments, from online farmer workshops, from stakeholder survey and interactive workshops. Stakeholders here, I mean policymakers, supply chain intermediaries, advisors, land agents, the whole mix of people who are in that supporting system around the farmer themselves. Thanks, Paul. Some very preliminary results back from our farmer survey. They're still coming in, but there's some interesting things here already. What we should have said is that each of the tool companies did recruit farmers. Some were existing tool users, but not by all means. Some had not used tools before. So we have a good balance there. We've also divided them into those that get a lower intervention and a higher intervention from the tool company. That's in terms of how much support they get when they do their assessment. So that when we come to the more in-depth interviews, we can start to unpack how these different variables affect their learning. But from a baseline survey point of view, uptake and experience, 64% have done a prior assessment and even more had entered their own data. The barriers to uptake before that had been no prior opportunity, and notably 46% said they were confused because there were too many tools, which is a kind of narrative we hear often. Interestingly, in the confidence gap in the middle there, a large majority were quite confident about data entry, but when it came to interpretation, decision making and understanding the science, the confidence drops considerably. Learning and impact, quite a large number felt they'd improved their understanding of the emissions, and 39% had observed changes. When it comes to support and training, they felt it's quite uneven. Nearly half of them had had no support, while some of them had had supply chain consultants, and 35% believed that advisors lacked the suitable knowledge. So the key message there, I think, overall is, as we put a note at the bottom, is invest in people, not just tools. So it's about not just making the tools better, it's about making people's ability to use them better as well, and to contribute to their development in a kind of more co-design process if we're able to. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So as I said, we had 5 interactive regional workshops with a range of stakeholders. We asked them these 2 questions beforehand. To what extent are the tools helping farmers to change or think about change? And how might we improve understanding of these tools in the farming and the advisory communities? So the next slide will show the results that we got back from these 2, the first of these 2 questions. It's quite interesting to see the variation in the different devolved nations at this point, you'll note that whilst England and Scotland have a slightly more positive view about how these tools are helping farmers to think about change, Northern Ireland is the most negative and Wales is in between, but notably about 20% or more in all those 4 countries ticked the don't know box. So, and these are stakeholders who came along to our regional workshop about greenhouse gas accounting. So I think that's quite telling in itself. And then, as an example from our Scottish workshop, and this is pretty much reflective of all the other workshops as well, I've just drawn out a few summary points that came up repeatedly in response to the second question about what improvements could be made. Communication, clarity and consistency. And remember, this is the perceptions of the stakeholders that I'm reporting on here. Improve clarity in purpose and methodology. Standardization and methodology, reduce the variability, be consistent with metrics and harmonize approaches. A message about the tool design and functionality, improve the use and integration with other systems. I think that talks to your point, John, about the interoperability. That message came out quite a lot between farmers about having to enter the data repeatedly in different systems. And to offer some sort of financial incentives and flag up the co-benefits of using these tools and making the outcomes more tangible. Then issues about education and capacity building, offering more opportunities for peer-to-peer learning, really make the outputs relevant to the daily farming practice and in terms of efficiencies and business and productivity. Trust and transparency. That was quite a common message as well. Improve trust in the data and the tools and in the motives behind them. There is a sense from farmers that supply chain processor motives are a little bit questionable sometimes. And then situate these tools in a much broader environmental and strategic context as well, because farmers are not only having to deal with greenhouse gas assessments, they're having to think about all the other demands on their farm about biodiversity and other sustainability objectives. So if we go to the next slide. So summarising the findings so far from those various data collections, they fall into these 3 areas, if you like. Firstly, we need to be better about explaining how the tools work, not only to farmers, but advisors and others in the supply chain and the knowledge system. Explaining that tools serve different purposes, as Eleanor's pointed out, provide a little bit more transparency and methodology. Although our 3 tool companies are transparent, others aren't, or there are perceptions that not all are. Think about the tool design and make the data entry easier. And then in the middle there, really think about the shift from numbers to meaning. What do these numbers mean for a farmer and how can they be acted upon? So that's all about interpretation and making informed decisions and really flagging up about the practical relevance and profitability there as well. And the third box is about learning. Learning versus reporting, which I'll reflect on in a minute, and building farmer and advisor capacity. So if we go to the next slide, Paul, I've got a few quotes from farmers just to illustrate some of those points. Thinking about then the first point of explaining how the tools work. These are just selected quotes just to give you a flavour of what's being said, but multiple tools are available with different methodologies and giving wildly different results according to this farmer. We need to provide clear understanding of the factors that contribute and how they're accounted for. And we need to socialise the carbon number. Whilst we talk about why to do it, we're not very good about contextualising or educating around the methodology. Next slide, thanks, Paul. And in that same frame as well about explaining how the tools work, there's a lot of scepticism and mistrust that is expressed about the credibility of these tools. Making farmers a little bit sceptical about the value to them. They can see the value potentially to the supply chain in terms of data collection, but not to their own farm. There's mistrust in the numbers and the calculations. this quote here, farmers think the calculators aren't calculating the way they want it to be calculated. And then the issue of methane and how that is calculated or used in the calculations is flagged up a lot by livestock farmers. And as we see from this quote here, you need to fix the giant lie at the heart of the calculations, according to this farmer. So I think these are reflective, obviously, of a whole diverse range of stakeholders and farmers, but it gives you a flavour of how these tools are perceived. Next slide, thank you. And then thinking about from numbers to meaning and acting on the assessments. As this comment says, we have to realise that a number doesn't mean an awful lot to a farmer. It needs to be interpreted. And there was a big emphasis about really flagging these up as cost savings and efficiencies and productivity gains of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions rather than just giving a figure. Another strong message that came out from across all the consultations we've had is this sense of avoiding a carbon tunnel vision, which some farmers see as a huge threat, particularly those in extensive systems or regenerative systems, where they feel unfairly judged, where often an intensive system of intensification, like indoor livestock, would fare much better in terms of a final figure compared to an extensive system. So next slide, thanks, Paul. And then on the final box, if you think about that earlier visualization, thinking about learning, this notion of learning versus reporting has cropped up quite a lot. Reporting seems to be associated with supply chain compliance, just filling in the data and seeing no value to the farm itself, whereas what we're interested in is where we can use these tools for learning. So in the first quote there is the question, is this about auditing and benchmarking or genuine decision support? And right now it feels like a compliance exercise without a clear purpose. But then counter to that, one tool specialist described how he had a group of farmers who were already using carbon accounting quite effectively, allowing them to observe and consider their carbon footprint and actually showing pride in lowering it as well and making effective decisions on the farm. When it comes to learning in terms of advisor capacities and farmers' capacities, these were in general felt to be quite low. And the general agreement was that advisors need to be upskilled in this area, but which advisors and what skills was a big question. And it's far more nuanced than just saying advisors need to upskill themselves with respect to these tools. So questions have been asked, do we need to build confidence or just simply develop more competent advisors? Do we need to invest a lot in really detailed training of advisors about the specifics of these greenhouse gas footprints and dynamics, or do we just need better advisors? Some suggest that we do need to invest a lot in training advisors to bring their scientific understanding up to date. And others have suggested it's completely unrealistic to consider that one advisor can possibly deliver the whole suite of tool understanding and specialism and understanding mitigation practices as well. So that's an area that needs a lot more explanation. And then the final slide is just bringing those points all together. So just to reiterate that it's a complex knowledge landscape out there. We need to enhance these skills and learning, support learning across the whole agricultural knowledge and innovation system. Think about context and capacities and fairness, not just learning and literacy in a simple sense. We've uncovered that there's a whole range of diverse users at different stages on the journey of learning as well. While some are very confident about using these tools and understanding them, for others, it's still a question of being very skeptical and untrusting. This notion of reporting versus learning, I think it needs more explanation. Considering advisors and what skills are required and what advisors as well. Really focus much more on the mitigation practices than on the number. And then abstracting this carbon, this idea of tunnel vision from a complex farm system, really feels that it detracts from other farm ecosystem benefits, and that's a concern for many farmers that needs to be addressed as well. So that's me. I'll stop there and happy to take clarification questions.
That's terrific. Thanks, Julie. Any questions of clarification before we shift into a broader discussion of the 3 talks that we've had today? John, would you like to come in again?
Sorry, yeah, and my apologies because I'm having to dash off. There's a carbon removal sort of task force meeting in 4 minutes, so I need to dash off. Just 3 things I just want to leave you with. Now that I realise that I come from the region that seems to be most opposed to calculators, I would just bring to your attention, and I think it's worth in your work just taking a moment to ask Northern Ireland why it's doing it. Northern Ireland's the only region of the 4 regions of the UK where both the industry and government have come together to back one calculator. And there is a single calculator being tendered for by DERA at the moment. And I just think it would be worth, your own team actually asking both DERA and the industry, why did you come together to do this? Because this gives you a different angle as such. And we are expecting the announcement of that tender very shortly. Just the 2 other issues on the calculators, I absolutely agree. I mean, I chair ArcZero. We've been on a journey now for 6 years of a group of 7 farms on a journey. We've been using calculators. 2 things we have done is, 1, in methane, we report it both ways. We report it using GWP 100 and we report it using GWP star. And I see my near neighbours in the Republic of Ireland are using GWP 20. But just to show the differences that reporting on methane makes, and it does help getting farmers on board when you actually start to tackle the methane issue. And the other issue is the lack of confidence in the factors used in calculators. In emissions, most of them are tier 2. On removals, most of them are tier 1. But actually, if you're a pioneering farmer wanting to move ahead, you want to get to tier 3. So that actually when your data goes into a calculator, you're not dumbed down by the national average. So there's a perverseness at the moment for pioneers and early adopters who are changing their behavior. Their activity data goes into a calculator that then actually dumbs down their performance because they're using national averages and not local averages. And I think those are issues that are going to have to be addressed if you want to win over the confidence that this is a tool to help farmers make better quality decisions rather than a tool just to audit them. And that has shut up.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That was really interesting about local versus national averages. Can I ask a question around what is a good number? So you're commenting that you get different numbers out of different calculators. Is this the kind of thing a farmer can talk about down the pub? My number is, I don't know, 46 tons. How do these actually work?
Well, I would certainly, my experience is we would encourage never anyone to talk about a single number. We talk about the journey. And so it's really important. And in my case, we've used AgriCalc and they have improved their calculator, just the same as the Cooler Farm Alliance is doing as well, is then they rerun my old numbers so we can compare apples with apples, not apples with oranges and pears. So as we come back every 2 years and repeat it again, we're using the latest version and our historic data is upgraded to that. For us, it is the journey that we talk about, not the actual number. So that is that journey, between your base, your first repeat, your second repeat. How is your journey changing? Is it positive? Is it negative? And that's the bit that we've been focusing on, rather than saying, my number's 26, what's your number?
And I think things can change from year to year, a wet year, a foot and mouth incidence. There's a whole range of contextual factors that can change from year to year that perhaps only a farmer would know. So would tend to agree with John, that sort of journey and that understanding of the journey is important.
I'll just finish on this comment just to build on Paul's. In our experience, we would like a rolling average of 3 calculator periods, so that we dumb down the seasonalization that Paul is mentioning. Is that you're seeing it, so if you did one in, say, 2020, one in 2022, one in 2024, one in 2026, you would take the last 3 and average them to try and dumb down that seasonal variation or whatever. It's particularly noticeable in arable farms, but we've noticed it in grassland farms as well.
That is really helpful. Thanks, guys. And I'm seeing a comment from Lizzie in the chat too. Bye, John. Thank you for coming. About how you wouldn't just look at BMI to assess somebody's health. I think by counter to that, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, I'm a social scientist. I'm not an expert in this at all. The thing with BMI is everybody knows what BMI is. And they know that there's problems with it, but they have some idea what it means. And I think when we're looking at emissions on farm, it can be very, very complicated. So I think it's terrific that we're trying to do some alignment and figure out how we can make it less complicated and easier to follow. Are there any better informed questions than mine out there that people would like to bring to this group?
Just to follow up a point, Leanne, one of the things we didn't show, which we could have, is we have sort of had those discussions that within the different nations within the UK, and how they, as John was indicating, how they're proceeding with greenhouse gas assessment and the support given. There is substantial variability there that's also interesting.
Can we talk about the pros and cons of the approach that's being taken in Northern Ireland? For the government going to tender and saying there shall be one. I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings, there shall be one ring to rule them all. What are the pros and cons of that kind of an approach?
So I think what's happening in Scotland is interesting. In there is a payment that farmers, or that the grant that farmers can have, or they need to undertake a greenhouse gas assessment. But the process is at present that data is for the farm itself, and it doesn't get fed through to somewhere else. So the idea is that it's informing the farmer, rather than being used as a metric to work out something else. And I think that encourages that learning process rather than a gaming sort of process.
Well, I think Julie pointed it out in her presentation, and I've seen that in other research, that if farmers are learning to do something and can actually see the benefits of what they're doing, they're a lot more likely to continue. I mean, it just makes common sense, really, but there's good social research data out there that demonstrate exactly that. Now, we have a question in from Sue Penlington. What are the next steps and timescales in terms of benchmarking each of the participant farms with other farmers using the same tool? Who would like to take that one on?
Yeah. So we've had a few things in terms of sort of recruitment and issues. So we've got 2 of the tools that have sort of collected the sort of data. With the third tool, we're sort of trying to bring that up to speed. And once we've got those together, we can start sort of doing those sort of comparisons. So hopefully over the next few months that should also be starting to come online.
So what will the end result of the project be? Not wanting to preempt it, but what are your objectives that you'll be thrilled? Sort of, I guess maybe a year and a half from now you'll be finished?
Yeah. Well, I guess so there's 5 broad objectives. So hopefully we'll meet on all of them. One was to engage and sort of create a community. So hopefully we're progressing on that. Julie, yours was sort of focused on the sort of understanding how to build capacity. The third is to improve the sort of harmonisation and understanding of the tools. We've also got an aspect looking at how do we verify the data being entered, and what's a cost-effective way of checking that. And then fifthly, looking at some of that broader sort of ecosystem mapping, issues such as people in supply chains versus those that are not, domestic production versus imports, tenants versus landlords, those sorts of issues we're intending to look at as well.
Good stuff. Someone has kindly pointed me towards a Q&A. I was just looking at the chat, so I've gone to the Q&A, and there's a question from Judith Thornton. When you spoke to farmers about their confidence levels in greenhouse gas tools, did you assess their competence? Given the amount of misinformation on greenhouse gas emissions, it would be interesting to know how many farmers are confident but likely to be wrong. And that's that old adage about how 75% of us think that we are great drivers and better than average.
Yeah.
What do you think?
That's a very good question. The confidence comments came from a quite rough and ready survey that we've done with farmers. We've yet to go out and talk to them in depth, and I think you can very quickly judge whether the confidence actually translates into competence when you start talking to farmers. I mean, having observed some of the assessments as well, it's the questions that farmers ask, particularly when they're completing the data entry. So we'll be using some of our learning framework questions about critical analysis and so on to answer that question, Judith, but it's a good one. Obviously, they're very slippery, abstract things to measure in the first place, confidence and competence. So we have to use various proxies to try and understand it. But I think it's whether you can interrogate the data and ask kind of sensible questions is always a good indication of your competence and your levels of understanding.
Other questions? We've got Vera Erie weighing in the chat, commenting on how actually having a single tool. Now, I know in the context of your research project, you're obviously working across 3 tools, so it's not really within your gift to say this one's better. So we're not going to ask you that. But what are the cons? Because though she's talked about the pros of having one calculator, what would the counter argument for that be?
Perhaps I can chip in here. I think it depends, going back, I think, to what I touched on, it really depends on why you're doing the assessments and the questions you're asking. For instance, I don't know whether that one calculator is whole farm or if it's for product level. If you wanted to do both, then you're going to be asking a lot more data from the farmer than if you're doing one or the other, unless you want to start making kind of I guess allocations based on your best knowledge, but not necessarily the data you have. And I think one of the cons then could be that tool doesn't fit farmers. I mean, the context, or some of the farmers at least, it might be more suited to others. I think John touched on it earlier as well, that, you know, we can't measure or model everything. There are definitely practices that farmers are doing that we don't yet have the capability to be putting into tools as they are. And I think if you just have one tool, then the chances that you have a tool that fits your context is potentially lowered. So that could be cons. Yeah.
Just from a different perspective as well, we've done a bit of work through our Fionn Evans, our postdoc at CCRI, looking at the tool landscape. And there's been a suggestion that if you start to standardize, it kind of quashes innovation and development of these tools. Because if you have a kind of freedom to expand and develop these tools individually, it allows greater progress. Obviously, it creates more complexity. And actually looking at the business ecosystem concept literature, about the dynamics of how innovations develop and move over time, there's a little bit of evidence to support that as well. So that's just looking at it from a different perspective.
I guess it's still a journey, and Vera specifically mentions their trade issues. So very often when it comes to trade, and you know, is beef from the UK better than, or a lamb from the UK better than lamb from New Zealand? I was in a presentation where some countries are starting, when making those sorts of claims, sort of standardizing how they've done it, so that the transparency is there as the method when it comes to sort of trade issues.
I can see that. Really helpful answers. Thanks, Guy. We'll come back to you in a minute, Nick. I'm going to go to the one from the comments from Zipping Wu asking, can you explain why results from the 3 calculators are different? Are you using different spatial and intertemporal emission factors? Are the results from the calculators validated in any way? I suspect the second half is probably the critical one, because I think we talked a little earlier in the presentations about how whether it depends on whether they're looking at the whole farm or whether they're looking along the supply chains. But can you give us a bit more detail on that and how the results are validated?
Yeah, so in terms of, if I start with the second part, in terms of results validation, I guess there's 2 components to that. So one is, are the methods validated? We at Cool Farm, for instance, are currently undergoing an external verification. So that is where our methods will be externally verified against international standards that we are consistent with. And I believe that's also the case for some other calculators have undergone this external verification. So that's a way that you can trust in the methodology. In terms of then the results, that then also depends on the data that's being put in. At Cool Farm, we don't at the moment offer a data validation, but I think, for instance, AgroCalc offer a data validation service. So those are the 2 components that you need to be considering when you look at your results. Obviously, the models are only ever as good as the data that you're putting into them. For instance, at Cool Farm, one of the things we do is we have a lot of like soft limits. So if we think your data looks a bit weird, we might say, are you sure this number's correct? But yeah, in terms of the data that's being put in, that is at the discretion of the user. In terms of why results from the 3 different calculators are different, I mean, there are a lot of different potential reasons. I don't know, I can't give you an exact answer, because I don't know every single one, but it could be there are different things. So for instance, at Cool Farm, we are a global tool. So we are used internationally. That means that we might take a different emissions factor than a tool that's more UK focused. If you're doing a product level assessment, those boundaries are different to if you're doing a whole farm assessment. So we might be taking different things into account that would then give you different results. It could even be how you're allocating between between the data you've put in. So how much fuel are you allocating, whether you've done it yourself or whether the system allocates it for you. So yeah, it's sort of hard to give you an exact answer because there are many different ways that they differ. It could even be, it could even be, for instance, that one calculator is using the most recent emissions factor, but the other one is just a bit behind in development and hasn't yet updated their software yet. It could be something as simple as that as well.
Thanks, Eleanor. That's really helpful. It's one of the great things about the Land Use for Net Zero program is that we have academics and people who are actually at the coalface developing these things working together. And I think it makes a really big difference for the quality of the work that we can do. Nick, would you like to come in? Nick is one of our Land Use for Net Zero members. He co-leads our Agile Policy Center. That's how I recognize the name, but his microphone is currently muted, which may be why we're having difficulty hearing him. There he is.
That might be a bit better. Sorry, Leanne. My IT capacity is very muted and limited as well. Just on your pros and cons question, I mean, hopefully it's a lesson learned, but one of the cons from some of these similar procurement exercises in the past has been the problem over legacy. So lots of people in my profession as a land agent moaned very strenuously when we went from single farm payment to BPS, and there was no provision in the original contract for legacy transfer. So we all ended up entering all the data again. So there are some commercial challenges around the end of procurement or the end of tender periods and procurement and how that's managed. I think, if I may, that begs another question, which we've been debating generally within the profession and with one or two lawyers, which is who owns the data and who can actually ask for it, because we've certainly had some land transactions where purchasers have asked for data and vendors have been reluctant. And Paul mentioned landlord and tenant relationships and landlords looking for data as part of benchmarking performance, for example. So we're having one of those usual slightly navel-gazing conversations that land agents have about how do we manage that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Yes, so in terms of who owns the data, I can speak on behalf of the 3 calculators in the project, is that the farmer still owns the data. So if you put your data into our platform, and it's the same, I think, with the other 2 calculators, the farmer is still the owner of that data, and we can always be contacted and be asked to remove it. In terms of if you, as a farmer, give your data to someone in the supply chain, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's up to whatever agreement you have with those particular actors. But in terms of the calculators, you very much own your data, and we are just a data processor, I guess we would say.
Can you comment on that more broadly, Eleanor, or maybe Paul or Julie? Because I remember back in Paul's presentation, there was something about Tesco encouraging or requiring its farmers to engage with some of these tools. Are they accessing that data then?
So yes, but they would have to have permission from the farmer.
Mm-hmm.
So I can just give you the example from Cool Farm, because it might obviously work differently with other tools. But yeah, so if we had a supply chain actor that asked their farmer to do an assessment, that could be done a couple of different ways. One way might be that they say send their farmer a questionnaire, or collect it alongside other data, and then they put it into our tool on behalf of the farmer, or the farmer might do the tool themselves and then share that data with the processor. So in that instance of them sharing the data with the processor, it's then, I guess, the agreement between whatever they have with that processor in terms of the data ownership.
Really
Is it the case, Eleanor, that a lot of the processors actually have the data already through other means, which they can automatically put into their own tools?
I think it depends. They might have some of that data already. There might be some overlap with things they already ask of their suppliers. But there's probably also things extra that they would need to be collecting. For instance, I can't imagine many processors are normally asking their suppliers for fuel use. So yeah, it's probably a bit of both. I think it depends on the system of that specific supply chain actor and how they generally engage with their farmers.
I'm noticing the question in the chat from Caio Fernandez Zany. Besides harmonization, are there any ideas or plans to make data collection easier for farmers? For example, could farm management software be used to streamline the process and allow farmers to feed information directly into the calculators like the FCT? So can you start, maybe for those of I'm not a farmer. I don't work with these tools. How long does it take to fill in one of these things? Is this kind of a 10-minute activity? Is it a 2-hour activity? And then could you talk about, is there progress being made to streamline that?
Yeah, okay. Well, in terms of how much time does it take? Yeah, it really depends. And it also depends on your experience. I would say the first time I would allocate half a day. That might be including to find all of the data. Obviously, once you get into the rhythm of doing them, it does become a lot quicker because you know where things are, you understand the data you're being asked for. So that first time is always a lot longer. But it also, it depends on your, partially depends on how good your data management system is. If that data is quite easy for you to find and you have everything in clear spreadsheets, then it might be a bit quicker than if you're, than if you don't know where to find it. So it can be a bit of how long is a piece of string of a question, but I would say at least the first time, maybe half a day, but could be longer, could be quicker. In terms of making data collection easier for farmers, I think that's something that we all want. And I think as tools, it's something we are always very conscious of, is that data burden. And it's always that trade-off that I guess particularly a lot of the academics will know is, we can get better models, but if we're increasing our models, we're probably going to be asking you for a lot more specific data to be running those. So we're always trying to get that balance. In terms of integrations with farm management software, yes, it's probably a potential if your management software is correct, or your records are correct. So I think that is a possibility, but people use multiple different types of software. Tractor, like My John Deere, they now record things like your fuel use, but that not everyone is using that, for instance. Everyone has different calculators, different platforms. So in an ideal world, maybe you would click a button and it would all sort of come together, but sadly in reality, it's a bit more complicated.
Is it actually better that farmers need to put that information together themselves? Because I would think that that's where the learning comes. When you can see your fuel bill changing, or you can see these different kind of measures, if it all just kind of happened automatically for you.
We have had these, Well, I was
No,
just going to
Julie,
say we have had those discussions in the project. Yes, I think there was one comment that we had from a supply chain tool user saying, I wouldn't like to let a farmer near the data entry for this. So because they didn't trust the farmer putting in the data. But then when you get to that point and the farmer isn't having any interaction with the data entry at all, then as you say, what are the learning opportunities for them? They've disappeared completely. It's out of their hands.
Well, that's interesting. Richard Davis is coming in that he has to also have to wait for data from others. So finding out from your contractor how much diesel they use, I would imagine. In big farming operations, this can be a bit of a nightmare trying to get all this information together.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of that learning, I think Lizzie actually once said at Farm Carbon Toolkit, they would say always just a farmer doing an assessment is useful, and there is learnings in that process. But I think Julie's work will really explore that a bit deeper and hopefully be really useful for that learning aspect.
We have had some farmers as well in the workshop the other day that had their own bespoke Excel sheets they'd created to ease the data entry and the data collection. So they said that it made life a lot easier for them if they filled in their own spreadsheets as they went along, so that when they came to complete the tool, they knew where to access this information. So I think everybody who treats it approaches it slightly differently.
That does sound like a good idea. We're down to 5 minutes left, and I believe I just have the one question left. If anyone has burning questions, please do put them into the chat or the Q&A. But for now, we will look at Tara's question, Tara Takahashi, on why are you comparing the outputs from the 3 tools? Is this to quantify the value of the additional harmonization, or to assess the uncertainty of an output from a single tool? What implications are you trying to extract from these results? Not challenging, just curious.
Yes, it's partly just a learning activity. As we sort of mentioned, it's a journey, understanding why there are different results, and can we explain it, and can we be transparent about that. And as Eleanor says, tools keep changing. So there was an ADAS sort of report comparing tools, but by the time that's been published, the tools have moved on. So it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, we don't necessarily see it as, there's no right or wrong in either answer, but I think it would be helpful for the industry to have this research that maybe explains where some of those differences are and why. I think it links a bit back also to Julie's nice diagram about transparency, and just to help understanding of why there are differences, and that's okay, but being really upfront about those. And I think that's where this project can be really useful.
Good stuff. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. This has been fascinating this afternoon, guys. Thank you for putting this on. It's really helped me understand better where the 3 calculators are coming from and what you're doing as a project. So thank you so much to Eleanor and Julie and Paul. I believe we have recorded this, so this will go onto the LUDSUB website, I think at some point down the road, and I believe you'll be publicizing it through your own institutions as well at CCRI and Cranfield and where have you. So do watch this space. Thank you all so much for coming and raising great questions, and I will gift you back with 3 minutes of your day.
Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.